All right, we will start to go live here in a moment, and this is also recorded, so we'll be sharing this everywhere.
Wow. Here we
once
go.
we're done. Yeah, the recordings get a lot of views, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I will totally follow your lead. You tell me when you want a reading, when you want to just kind of riff. Do you do Q&A with whoever's out there?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
And there are some people out there. They're starting to come in. They're finding their seats. You can hear them kicking the folding chairs. They're all silencing their cell phones. And I'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Wiley Cash. I am the host of Reader Meet Writer. I am also the writer in residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and the 2019 recipient of the Pat Conroy Legacy Prize from SIBA. SIBA is the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance, and it is an organization that represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. So perhaps this evening, one of those bookstores is the reason you are here. You are a fan of Clay's work, and you said, oh my God, if I could only attend that event, and a bookstore said, as a matter of fact, here's a link. Please reward that bookstore by purchasing this book, Whisper Down the Lane, or any other books that you are interested in from the bookstore that brought you here tonight. They are the lifeblood of our literary community, and they need our support now more than ever. And one of the ways that you are supporting independent bookstores is by joining events like this. We've been doing, I was telling Clay in our virtual green room, where we eat only red M&Ms and do a ton of cocaine before the broadcast goes live, that we have done dozens and dozens of these events since July. And these are events that would otherwise be happening in your local independent bookstores. But because we can't be on the road, we are bringing the events to you in the best way we can. And that is through these virtual events. So thank you for coming. Thank you for supporting our authors. Thank you for supporting SIBA. And thank you for supporting your other independent bookstores across the South. I want to mention we have another event coming up next week, Tuesday, April 13th at 7 p.m. I've got a copy of the book, not at my fingertips right now. Here it is. The Salt Fields is a new novella by Stacy D. Flood. Stacy will be with us Tuesday at 7 p.m. and we hope that you will join us for that event as well. But tonight, y'all are here to hear Clay McLeod Chapman talk about his new novel, Whisper Down the Lane. And I want to give a very brief, I tried to put together my own biography of Clay, and it was like trying to read Dante's Inferno and write a 2-page paper, because he does so many things across so many different genres and forms and has his finger in so many things. And so I've got a very paltry biography, but we will get to the other things that he does by the end of the show, because I'm really interested in talking about that. And many of you are interested in, you may know Clay from something else that he does aside from writing novels. But he does write novels, he writes comic books, he writes children's books, and he writes for film, and he writes for TV. He is into podcasting, he is into all kinds of art forms to bring you these terrifying stories. And he teaches writing at the Actors Studio MFA program at Pace University. And Whisper Down the Lane, with this wonderful jacket and wonderful feel. The texture of the book has a wonderful feel. It is his new novel. So Clay, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me. This is amazing. That was a great bio. That you did me proud, man. So thank you. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And I want to talk about the other many things that you do toward the end of the show, and also how you got into doing the many things that you do, because a lot of us, I'm speaking from experience, have a really hard time cracking into the fiction world. That you've broken into a lot of worlds. And so I don't want to, make you uncomfortable, but I would like to talk about that
that's great.
at the end of the show. But before we do, can you talk about, give us just a quick synopsis of Whisper Down the Lane without giving anything away?
Oh man. Can I give a quick synopsis of Whisper Down the Lane? I mean, Whisper Down the Lane is, it's about two people. We have Sean, who is 5 years old in 1983, who tells a little white lie to his mom. And that little white lie starts to kind of reverberate and echo throughout the, outside of the house and into his school and into his community, until that little white lie suddenly kind of consumes the nation and kind of dovetails into the Satanic Panic period that our country was under for over 10 years. But yes, so one little white lie basically kind of, consumes his family, his friends, his teachers, the other people within the small town that he lives in. And it gets bad. So then fast forward, 30 some years later to Richard. And Richard is a recently married art teacher. And Richard, with his wife, he now has a son. He's never had a son, it's a stepson. And he's going through the process of adopting this young boy by the name of Elijah. And what's interesting about Richard is that suddenly strange things start to happen around him. And the things that are happening just so happen to be some of those little white lies that Sean told when he was a boy 30 years ago. I'm being a little coy because I feel like there's a spoiler, not spoiler. Anyone who picks up the book and reads the jacket will pretty much know that these two individuals share a little bit more than maybe first meets the eye. But the lies that Sean told as a child end up coming to haunt Richard as an adult. And, basically the past is never quite through with us these days.
That is certainly the case. And, I'm a child of the 80s. I'm probably a little bit older than you. I was born in 1977 and I grew up.
I was born in 1977.
Are you for real?
I'm for real. Do you see that gray in that beard?
Well, I'm a little more gray than you. You've got the tasteful, dark, but I'm all gray.
I basically
I remember
all through the, before this started, but I didn't get to finish it.
But I remember well the Satanic Panic of the 80s. I was raised in a Southern Baptist church in North Carolina. And I remember what happens when you play Led Zeppelin backwards. I remember all the Satanists on the Oprah Winfrey Show or Geraldo Rivera. I remember all of the many, drive-in religious festivals that were taking stands against Satanism. And what was it like to go back to that time, which was really an hysterical moment, an hysterical cultural moment for the United States? What was it like to go back to that time? And how did you pick up little pieces of it to drive the tension, the plot, and some of the characterizations in the novel?
Good question. I mean, I was a child of the 80s. Like, I feel like I grew up with those Spielbergian lens flares. I grew up in Virginia. I was born in Roanoke and raised in Richmond. And it, that kind of suburban Southern existence, we lived, like the neighborhood kids kind of lived in the streets, like we schwinned, for blocks. And it's kind of a miracle that none of us broke our necks because frankly, our parents just let us loose and we played. But there was always this threat. And the threat was don't get in the van with no windows. If someone says they are your uncle and you don't know who they are, don't believe them. Stranger danger, Sure. And it permeated everything. So there's that strange kind of cognitive dissonance between like being completely free to play, but also, until the sun came down, and we got called in for dinner. But beyond that, there was also this kind of like, I want to say malaise, but there was a certain kind of like, there's just like a low grade threat throughout the afternoon. And we were made very aware of it. And maybe it was there to kind of scare us straight, but like it was honestly like, there are people out there and they will XYZ. And we believed it. So when we went bike riding and we found that kind of like concrete, the wall with the spray painted pentagram and the 666 and like the kind of like embers of an old, like bonfire and beer bottles, we were like, we have found it. We have found the den in our neighborhood. And as a kid, you kind of mythologize all of that so that as an adult, see, the fact of the matter is, with Whisper Down the Lane, I get to write as myself, as both a child and as an adult. So all of the stuff from the Sean era that's moments from my childhood. I'm not writing about myself, but I'm writing of myself.
Sure.
So as an adult now, I am a parent. I have 2 boys, and nothing terrifies me more than the idea of these 2 kids going out into the world. And when the day starts, it's a little bit different now with quarantine, but when we would see them off to school, the heart would start palpitating, because there'd be this sense of like, I can't protect them anymore. Like I can't hold on to them. So as a writer, what am I doing but just spending my day creating the most heinous kind of worst case scenarios in my head of like, oh God, what if this happens, or what if that happens? So, I mean, long story short, Whisper Down the Lane essentially became kind of my opportunity to kind of exorcise very specific fears that I've had in my life, both as a child and now as a father.
And I want to say for folks who are watching us who may have questions, don't save your questions until the end. Go down to the chat box, type your question in, say your name and the name of your home bookstore if you've got a question for Clay. Put it in now. At the end of the show, I'll look at those questions. You're not going to interrupt anything by asking your question now. But please, questions are some of our favorite things as writers. We've said it all, we've thought it all, and we don't find a lot of new things until you ask your question. But Clay, the way you just described your childhood described my childhood to a T. And what you said about finding the burned out, cement wall with the pentagrams and the scribblings and the beer bottles is so resonant of my own childhood. And what's amazing to me as a parent is oftentimes we tell our kids scary things to like warn them off of doing something. But I think the 80s, especially knowing you're from Virginia and me being from North Carolina, I think my parents kind of believed it. I think my parents absolutely believed, which seems so incongruent with the freedom they gave us, because we too, I mean, we would go back in the woods behind my house. We had like a club made of fallen down dangerous trees called Halloween Hollow. So even the names we gave our play were affected by the Satanic Panic, the things that we did, the stories we told, the games we played, the names we used. And when you were writing the book, was there anything cultural particularly, or an experience you had that you drew from to say, that scared me to death? Now I draw the line from my experience to this example in the book, or to this scene in the book where I want, the kids to be scared in the way that I was scared, or the parents to be scared in the way my parents were scared.
I might be a little biased purely because I'm on this side of the spectrum now and I'm no longer that child. But I do think that that's the joy of the oral tradition. Like I feel as if for a lot of my personal writing, I love first person narrative, and I love the idea of like creating an environment, whether it's on the page or on stage, wherever it may exist, where the reader, the listener, the audience feels as if they're kind of taking part in something. So reading a book like this, I want them to feel as if they are being like, this is the story that is being told to them. We create our own campfires, but like to scare, like so much of what the 80s was you have to be afraid in order to be safe. And I I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the equivalent is today, because I feel like it's like you have to have your parental controls on to be safe. And what is that you're watching on YouTube right now? So for me, like I love urban legends, and I love a ghost story. But what if the ghost story is something more, more human? And I feel like urban legends and the ability to kind of like tell a story that, it's a little bit more mercurial, but it like passes on. Like, did you ever hear the story about the guy who died on the train tracks back there? Well, his ghost is still there. And it's like that transmissibility was far more effective back in the 80s. I feel like it is an art form in of itself. So I wanted to imbue that sense, that quality of like, there are certain sections where there's a Mr. Stitch, who is a scarecrow in the center of a corn maze. The corn maze is something that actually, the event that takes place within the corn maze is something that did happen to me as an adult, which was terrifying. So, but there was no kind of haunted scarecrow in the middle of it. So yeah, there's like a weird kind of like DNA helix of both kind of fact and fiction. My personal experience is kind of slowly intertwining with something a little bit more, hopefully a little bit more eloquent and majestic. But yeah.
And I want to talk about that specifically a little bit later. What is the role of horror, and why is horror good for us in many instances, and what is the ethical, role of horror in American culture, and how does it wake us to things, and how does it, make us aware of things that we might not otherwise be aware of. Can you talk about Richard and Sean? You mentioned them very briefly, but can you talk about them as characters and kind of the polarity of innocence and experience, but then also the role that youth plays in the story, and the role, I'm thinking about like the Salem witch trials, and the role that young people played in those with rumor and white lies. Can you talk about the polarity of these two characters, youth experience, age, young man, young kid?
I mean, well, the kind of immediate response that came to mind was trauma, and I feel like Sean, which is the Sean section, the 1983 section. Sean's 5 years old, and the challenge of kind of writing for someone so young. I wanted to kind of root his character and his kind of point of view in a certain. There's a certain filter to it, and beyond first person narrative, it was always like, how does Sean observe the adults around him, and like how does it's almost like Sean is not one step removed, but there's a layer to it where every thought, every kind of like reaction is a response to something that is being told to him or said to him. So in a very strange way and in an abstract way, he's a puppet, and a lot of that has to do with his youth, his age, and the fact that he is within a single mother family unit, and the two of them are very close, and yet the kind of circumstances that they're in are kind of putting a strain on their relationship. So he just wants to do the right thing. He just wants to make his mother happy, which, how does a 5-year-old intuit what would make your adult mother, happy? Is it if I do this? Is it if I say this? If the questions start to kind of lead, a child in one direction, there's that sense of like, this is what I need to do. So, for Sean, who basically is puppeteered by the adults who kind of come into his life, whether that's his mother, the authority figures, police officers, detectives, his therapist, the judge, teachers. Like there's so many adults that kind of create an identity around him, which is not him. So the funny thing about you say innocence, and to me, I feel like it's writing his character was to kind of show someone who needed to be, it was like a vessel that needed to be filled. And unfortunately, a lot of the kind of personality that was filled into that was by other people who had very specific agendas, and not necessarily the best of agendas, which I think kind of plays into the kind of era and the particular, things that were happening at the time. Now with Richard, you have a survivor of trauma, and that he is at a place in his life where he has been fortunate and privileged enough to wipe the slate clean. He no longer identifies as who he was as a child, and it has given him permission to just be whoever he wants to tell people. He can tell his wife he's this person. He can tell the people he works with he's this person, and they all buy it. They believe it. And it's not necessarily that it's not true as much as it is, this is the story that this is the version of my life, my narrative that I'm going to tell. And like, I don't know. I mean, I wonder, like, when you're doing an interview and they're like, so tell us about your life. Like, what was it like growing up? And if you do that, you have that answer kind of ready. And it's like, that's the version of your life. That's the story that you've created. And it's mostly true for sure, but it's like, it's a version of yourself. And Richard is a character who has created a version of himself that, it's covering up a lot of stuff. So I think, in writing it, like, I wanted to create people who were almost like two halves of one whole, I guess you could say. And as the story progresses, maybe those two halves smash back together again.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to talk about a lot of it without talking about all of it. One thing that you're really known for is your readings and I'll say performances. Would you read a little bit of the book to us? Just read it, maybe as
sure. Yeah. I would love to. This is when this is the make or break, right? Like I have to prove that this is worth your time. I've read from the first chapter, the very, very beginning of the book, just because
which is daunting. That is an engaging scene, to say the least.
So I'm either gonna lure you in or I'm going to lose you forever. But I feel like you got to hit the ground running. So apologies up front. This is I'll just read the first few pages of the very, very beginning chapter, which is from Richard's point of view in 2013. So here we go. It's been nice knowing you, everybody. They found Professor Howdy spread across the soccer field. What was left of him, anyway. His chest cavity had been carefully cracked open, his rib cage fanning back as if it were the glistening crimson trigger hairs on a Venus flytrap, patiently waiting for its prey to wander inside its gaping maw. The entirety of his intestines, both large and small, had been gingerly unspooled to the end of their connective tissues across the lawn in some sort of luminous pattern. I say luminous because his guts looked like beams of wet sunlight radiating out from the rest of his hollow self. Pattern because there seemed to be a particular, methodology to the placement of his organs. Someone arranged them to look this way on purpose, to see. For who, though? My son is walking in right as we do this. This is rated R. You're far too young for this. Give me one quick second. I'm so glad this is live. I will be right back. Hey guys.
This is something that happens quite frequently to me, and I'm glad to see it finally happen to somebody else that I've been on a Zoom with. I have a 6-year-old and a 5-year-old girls, So it's nice to see a little boy on the screen and not just one of my girls, because I have two kids who are very, very well practiced at interrupting.
That was amazing. Where were we? Oh yes.
Guts.
Guts everywhere, luminous pattern. Whew. I mean, it felt like he was meant to be revered. And I say revered because, even to my eye, there was something beatific to the way his body was presented, holy almost. And trust me, this is coming from a completely non-religious person. I've never even set foot inside a church. That's not entirely true. I mean, there were a few visits to Sunday school as well. I can barely recall them at this point, but they're distant memories by now. I vaguely remember taking communion as a kid, once. Take and eat, the pastor said as he pressed a stale cracker past my lips. For this is my body. And that dry sacramental wafer adhered itself to the roof of my mouth. I couldn't wash that pasty undertaste for the rest of the day, stuck with this phantom flavor on my tongue. But that was years ago. I mean, a whole lifetime ago. All I'm trying to say is, even I could sense the awe of this grisly exhibition, feel it somehow. The downright ardor of it. Professor Howdy's lungs fanned out like angel wings flapping against the grass. The liver, the stomach, the spleen, I mean, that is the spleen, isn't it? Placed with exacting precision. Each organ was its own celestial body orbiting the corpse it had erupted from. His heart now rested in the patch of grass directly above his head, a bleeding crown. Dawn broke an hour or so before our school's groundskeeper, Diego, I think his name is, discovered the poor professor. The morning sun found his body first, pelt glistening in dew. His blood had a crystalline sheen against the green, like red stained glass, something that you might see in Sunday services. Saint Howdy, our school's tragic rabbit, angelic white fur and glazed over pink eyes, captured amongst all of the other apostles. Professor Howdy was kept in Miss Castevet's classroom. He belonged to the school, its students, but Miss Castevet was ultimately responsible for his upkeep. And that meant cleaning out his cage, feeding him, picking up the poo pellets, the nitty gritty stuff that nobody else, particularly the kids, ever wanted to get their hands dirty doing, God, students were always welcome to stop by Miss Castevet's room and pay Professor Howdy a visit. She had designated feeding hours for anyone to swing by and, offer up a handful of rabbit chow for him to nibble directly out from their palm. And sometimes, on the specialist of occasions, as Miss Castevet liked to say, she would even pull Professor Howdy out from his cage and let him, hop around the room. Doors closed, of course. There had been that one particular instance, at the very beginning of the school year when someone, I'm not naming any names here, Benjamin Pendleton, he left the classroom door open and the poor professor broke free, hopping down the hall. The ensuing bunny hunt, was a school-wide event. All the students got involved in the search party, but eventually he ended up in my classroom. I spotted him tucked behind the tempera paints, struggling to squirm further in. I was hailed as a hero for returning the professor to his cage unharmed, alive, and in one piece. The new art teacher saves the day, the students all sang out. Yay, Mr. Bellamy. Everybody loved Professor Howdy. He was, without a doubt, the Danvers School's unofficial mascot. Who would think about doing something as awful as this to a rabbit? Our rabbit. And I'll end it there.
All right. That was fantastic. Thank you, Clay. That was great. I'm sure none of our viewers assumed it was going to be a human corpse.
Never.
Never. So I want to ask you, and we have some questions kind of loading in, and I want to make sure other folks get theirs in. So if you have questions, please type them in. Make sure you mention your name, the name of your home independent bookstore. But I want to ask you, given the breadth of your experience in the genre and the many things you do, I want to ask you, what makes horror so fun to write? Or, assuming maybe you don't enjoy writing, it's just a compulsion, what makes you feel compelled to write horror?
Yeah. Whew. It's a doozy of a question. And I feel like there may be 2 or 3 answers. I mean, I was exposed to the genre at a way early age, too early. Like, the one babysitter, had Halloween on, and that was essentially kind of the first kind of like, oh my God, this is entertainment. People watch this for, the kind of cognitive dissonance of like, why would someone desire to watch this? And this is, as a kid, like not understanding it. And yet, from that point on, like feeling some sort of whatever it may be, like it was the desire was there. And I feel like, this is pop psychology here, forgive me, but once the nerve had been tapped, it became this kind of like, returning to it, to like tap it even more. And for better or for worse, like I've been a fan of the genre ever since. I mean, I just kept watching, even when I wasn't allowed to. Like that was the forbidden fruit. Writing it was obviously just kind of a natural extension of absorbing it, imbibing it. But I think that the need for it is twofold, and I think horror plays a very valuable role within art, literature, cinema. Wherever you partake. I do think it is necessary on one level to have the pressure release. I think there's always the kind of applicable metaphor of like it's like riding a roller coaster, that you get to experience the thrill of death without experiencing death. And I do think there is something to be said about like getting to the precipice of something unseen or unknown, and kind of, I don't know, like experiencing it on even just on a kind of just surface level. But I think also horror as a genre, but as a kind of force, it does allow us as both artists and people and audience members to experience something that I feel like that we experience. We are dealing with things in the world, and whether that's today, 10 years ago, back to the Salem witch trials, like I do think that, like, the fears that we experience outside on a, turn on the news, walk down the street, wherever it is that you kind of like, engage with the world, that is a lot. There's a lot to be afraid of. And I think that by kind of absorbing it, like if I watch too much, 24-hour news, I have this anxiety, and it's like I am absorbing fear, but I'm not exercising it. I'm not releasing it. It's like calcifying itself inside me. And now horror, I think, it allows us to put a mask on those real world anxieties, those real world fears. The power of metaphor, I think, is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I think horror in of itself embraces metaphor almost to operatic levels. We've created these mythic creatures, vampires, Frankenstein, werewolves, serial killers. I mean, like, you name it. Like it's like these creatures are like they are in service of the anxieties of the time. And I think the durable zombie trope is that it reinvents itself almost every generation. And that to me is amazing, that like You can go from Night of the Living Dead to Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and it's like it somehow has not only reinvented itself, but spoken specifically to the times. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a phenomenal triptych. Well, there's four of them, probably more. But like if you watch the 50s version versus the 70s version versus the 90s version, they speak to specific anxieties of the time. And I don't know, if Colson Whitehead can write a zombie novel, that's an amazing thing. And like I think, we've created, we've kind of like used the metaphors that have been around for centuries, and they're very, very durable. And we also create new ones. But horror, it just kind of allows us to kind of experience, but also release. And I think that the release factor is far more valuable than I think we give credit to the genre. It's not so much that it like stays inside, though I do think the testament of a great novel or a great movie is when the movie's over, you close the book and then you're still kind of dealing with it. But I do think it's like having the chance, having the ability to tap into that fear impulse that we have inside, but then let it go.
I love what you just said. I'm going to go back and write much of this down for a course I'm actually teaching next semester.
What's the course?
It's I'm kind of subbing. Well, I might be teaching next semester. We'll see. I can't say just that I might be teaching. But I've had a lot of questions about horror and what you just said. And I'm going to get to everybody's question, but I know we're running out of time. But what you just said so beautifully about the world is so terrifying on its own. The reality of the world is so terrifying on its own. And we watch the 24-hour cable news cycle and we have nothing to do with that terror. But then we watch a horror movie and we see the execution is the word I'm looking for. It's also the wrong word, right word. The execution of that terror to its end. Yeah. And there is some kind of release that we don't get in our lives. That was so well said. We've got some questions coming in. Someone asks, what was your research like for this book?
Copious. I imbibed, man. I feel like, if you buy the book, there's actually a reading list at the end of the book. Like I feel like I needed to come clean and be very honest about like, these were the books that proved so beneficial. And I couldn't have written my story without them. But I do want to give a shout out to one particular book, nonfiction book called We Believe the Children by Richard Beck. It is an astounding book. And, you'll read my book and you'll say to yourself, that didn't happen. There's no way that could have happened. But then you read We Believe the Children, and then you say to yourself, oh, okay, truth is stranger than fiction. So, it kind of falls under the, like, they couldn't make this up, even if they tried.
We've got another question, and this question was asked before your son came into the room, I promise. But Amanda at page 158, an independent bookstore in Wake Forest, North Carolina, Amanda asked, how do you balance parenthood with your writing, your teaching, and I'll say now the many other things you do across multiple written and spoken and moving, film. How do you do all of this? Where do you find the time to do all of this? Do you just have like the most patient partner ever, or do you just not sleep? I mean, really, how do you do all of this?
I mean, it's a balance. It's a juggling act. And a lot of times my wife and I we tag team. So it'll be like, what are you doing for the next hour here? But we're very fortunate. We live here in Brooklyn. We have a house. So there is space in order to be in our respective corners, so that space has become such a commodity during these strange times. It has been, our oldest son, who's 8, has found reading. and he's a bit of a reader now, and maybe that would not have been the case if he wasn't stuck inside all day and only had 1 hour of screen time. Like it's definitely very it's totally challenging, and as you can see, sometimes they can be very conniving and very that we have a bunch of Houdinis in this house. But that said, like, we're very fortunate. And Winter, nobody went shack wacky. There was no kind of Jack Torrance shining moment in our house. But man, oh man, it's been 14 months.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
We're alive.
So it sounds like you've got this system kind of set up to get the support where you need it to be relieved, to go do your thing, your teaching, your writing. I mean, the breadth of your
virtual. I mean, I haven't been in a classroom in over a year.
Yeah.
I guess the most applicable answer is I wake up early. I wake up before anybody else, and I try to get my writing done before, as much of it done as humanly possible before everybody else can wake up, so that the two of us can start really running interference before my wife's actual 9 to 5 job starts. The sun ain't up when I start.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And that's what it has to be for a lot of us to get anything done. Well, man, this has been so fun, Clay. I feel like I've really kind of seen the genre anew, in our times anew. So thank you so much for joining us. And I guess my time in the 80s anew as well from the book. But this was a blast. So everybody watching tonight, please order Clay's book, Whisper Down the Lane, from the independent bookstore that brought you here this evening. And join us on Tuesday for Stacy Flood's book, The Salt Fields. I'll be with Stacy Tuesday at 7 p.m. right back here at Reader Meet Writer. But I hope you all have a wonderful evening. And Clay, again, man, thank you so much. It's a pleasure hanging out with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course.
Have a good night, everyone. Stay safe.
Good night, everybody.